A Galene Woman Is finally talking about PMDD. Hi, I'm Cole, your host for A Galene Woman Is, and this week, as I'm sure you've guessed, we are talking about PMDD. We're going to discuss what it is, why it changed my life, and why ultimately we really should be talking about conditions like this more. I am going to preface this with a trigger warning. We are dealing with a condition that deals with mental health struggles, including suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, and there is a brief mention of grief as well. So I really do recommend taking check of whether or not this is an episode that's good for you and whether or not this is going to be beneficial. There are plenty of other episodes to listen to, so please come and join us for something else if you think this is going to be too much. But I just wanted to make sure that we checked in before we started. So let's get into all things PMDD. Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder, or PMDD, is something I think very few people have actually heard of. But if I were to say that I think the majority of us with uteruses would know exactly what that's like. Unscientifically, PMDD for me is like an incredibly awful form of PMS, or Premenstrual Syndrome. It can be crippling, confusing, and it's often a very misunderstood condition. And yet, if I think about all the discussions I've ever had about periods in sex ed or normal conversations around the menstrual cycle, I don't think I ever really got an explanation of what PMS actually is, let alone something like PMDD. Decoding the stats on this is very tough, especially considering how little is genuinely known about PMDD or how little interest is taken into understanding mood disorders sourced from reproductive health. Roughly around 5 to 8% of women, or those of the AFAB community, will suffer with some sort of premenstrual disorder that has symptoms on the level of severity as PMDD. I once heard someone describe their experience of PMDD as wanting to hit the self-destruct button for about 2 weeks every month. Honestly, I couldn't think of a better way of explaining it. The continue up and down, the erratic nature of it all is very much self-destruct mode. Unfortunately, it took me not only 2 years to actually acknowledge what was happening, but also to actually be able to deal with the problem properly too. To break it down, premenstrual dysphoric disorder causes severe emotional and physical symptoms every month. Typically, it happens around a week or two before your period. So this means from a menstrual cycle perspective, it occurs during the luteal phase, where your estrogen really begins to drop and your progesterone is at its highest. Interestingly though, while PMDD is directly connected to your menstrual cycle, it is not a hormonal imbalance. PMDD is a severe negative reaction in the brain to the natural rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone. This means that the problem with PMDD, and perhaps the most important element of this condition when deciphering what it actually is and how it's affecting you, is that in this 2-week period, it affects your everyday life to the same extent that something like depression would. It becomes incredibly difficult to function, even on the most basic of levels. But as soon as your period starts, or sometimes a few days into it, this completely disappears, and you're totally functional in the way you normally would be. It leaves you in this constant, somewhat confusing loop of feeling like you're at the end of the world to back on normal ground again. I wanted to give you a list of some of the symptoms that are given on the IAPD, or International Association for Premenstrual Disorder, to kind of give you a holistic overview of what we're looking at. So firstly, there are the emotional experiences. Extreme mood swings, feeling upset, tearful, hopelessness, that was a really big one for me. A lack of energy, not a lot of interest in activities you would normally enjoy. Feeling easily angered, irritable, or anxious. Again, that was another one that I really suffered with. And also there's an extreme difficulty in concentrating, which I think brings on a really strong sense of overwhelm, which can be really difficult to manage or know what to do with. But in the majority of cases, unfortunately, PMDD does lead to suicidal feelings. There are some physical experiences too. These are things such as headaches, feeling bloated, changes in your appetite, sleep problems, and increased anger and conflict with the people around you. With a condition such as this, the social stigma is incredibly heavy. Finding true and accurate information can feel like searching for a needle in a haystack that nobody wants to talk about. The lack of widespread recognition and understanding of what PMDD means that has meant that I kind of had to dive into the research, watch all those specialist interviews, read through all the posts on online communities completely by myself. And it took me a long time to get to that phase because initially I didn't even want to acknowledge that I had it. Looking back on my experience with PMDD over the past couple years, I think I can pinpoint quite easily when it started. I'd always been someone who suffered with pretty bad moods off the back of my period. Even though it wasn't obvious to the people around me sometimes, deep unhappiness and just general misery because of my period happened pretty much every time. However, when I hit 18, I genuinely think that unhappiness took on a whole new meaning. I turned 18 at a pretty critical moment for the entire globe. I turned 18 in the middle of 2020, so slap bang in the middle of the COVID pandemic. In fact, on my 18th birthday, I specifically remember the UK government announced the third and thankfully final lockdown would be starting that very day. So all the colleges and schools closed on my birthday. And reflecting back on it, it's kind of crazy to think about. You know, my A-levels got cancelled. I was barely seeing my friends. I was stuck inside. And not only that, my birthday's in November, so it was cold and dark outside. But I definitely believe at this point there was something more going on for me. I'd always been a very hard worker, I prided myself on being a good student, but very suddenly it felt very difficult to do any work, and I was not keeping up with anything that my final year of college had kind of brought on for me. Even though I was terrified of failing, I could not get myself out of what I thought was this kind of lazy, sluggish mentality, and I would ignore my work for days on end, not even trying to complete it, but specifically during this 2-week period just before I started menstruating. I would spend hours and hours lying in bed, on the sofa, pretending I was just taking some time out, when in reality I just couldn't bring myself to do anything. I was hopeless and teary all the time, and to make matters worse, for a large part of it, I was obviously stuck in the same four walls during the dead of winter. All ideas of exercise or mindful walks just didn't exist. But I genuinely think the even scarier part for me was the fact that it was having such a large impact on my external life, like beyond myself. I was arguing with my friends more. I was blowing up over the silliest of things. I would be incredibly irritable, but it only seemed to happen during this 1 to 2 weeks lot just before my period. There were so many thoughts going through my head. Was I depressed? Was I being dramatic? Was it all actually real? This one I still worry about even after diagnosis. But the thing is, after my period, I would be fine. I could work, I was energetic, productive. I could be irrational and emotionally calm over things that the week previous had me spiraling. I was so conscious of it all, I became incredibly good at making sure nobody saw I was struggling or that very, very people saw me in those states. But of course, it was hardly going to solve the problem or the root issue. At this point, we can do a little bit of fast forwarding because, as I said, I became incredibly good at functioning with it all. And honestly, during this period, I did not want to deal with it. 18 to 20 was a huge period of my life. A lot happened. And by August 2022, life looked incredibly different to what it had back when I first started noticing these symptoms. The first time I ever heard the term PMDD, though, was when I was on holiday with my family. What's kind of funny is thinking about the 6 to 7 months prior, from like February to this point in August, I would say were some of the most wonderful experiences I'd ever had. My gap year was definitely a success, but even now I can see that PMDD was marring my whole experience with these real big pockets of just sadness and hopelessness. Like, I have a very, very vivid memory of being in my ex-partner's home, and I was sat outside and we just had a really, really wonderful day, and all I could think was how miserable I was. So there were so many examples that I could think of that were like that and that was so difficult for me to get through, and I just had zero explanation as to what it was. Back to this holiday. Of course, because we all get our periods when we don't want them, I was in my luteal phase while I was on this holiday. So while I was lying in the sun, trying to be positive, I was seriously struggling. My family and I were all together in the sun, having a really, really wonderful time. And I did enjoy myself. I was so incredibly grateful that we were getting to do this. But in all honesty, I just wanted to continually cry. And I dread to think how many times I did. I was so tired of feeling like this. The constant up and down, functional to not functional, within weeks. It was exhausting. I discovered the term PMDD completely randomly. I was scrolling through Instagram by the pool. So incredibly groundbreaking, I know. But this is where I found it. It was an interview with a woman just describing her symptoms of PMDD, how it only affected part of her month, and that she'd been battling with depressive thoughts and behaviours for a significant proportion of her life. And it had impacted her social and familial life also. Basically, everything that I had been fighting against for years. Of course, at this point, the excuses as to why I didn't want to solve the problem, even after learning of the condition that I most likely had, were continual. I was just cranky because it was hot, or it was cold, or I had too much work to do, or that I was irritated by something or someone in the present moment, and that it would pass. Also, by this time in my life, I had suffered with 2 incredibly bad bouts of anxiety that had led to me being sick, homebound with nerves. But I had gone to therapy, and I truly had genuinely learned how to manage my anxiety by this point. I thought I was over with my blip with mental health, and it meant that acknowledging what I had just been told was so far from what I wanted to do. It hadn't occurred to me in those sessions to mention the continually awful PMS symptoms I had, because now I just wanted to rationalize them as nothing more than PMS. I didn't want it to be more than that. All this lady's interview had said to me was that it wasn't over, and this time it was going to happen every month. I also had a pretty big excuse at this time, and that was my dad, who had unexpectedly passed away in November 2021. So naturally, any experiences that I had had of PMDD, I'd put down to that. For sure, grief had exacerbated the situation, but it was not the root cause at all, and I was so keen to just avoid it. At this point, I had 2 choices. Continue ignoring the destructive, depressive behaviours I'd been battling with these past 2 years, or try and solve the issue. I had spoken to a couple friends and my mum about it all, and I came to the conclusion that if I kept living like this, I was just going to collapse. The first thing I needed to do was track my mood alongside my cycle, which, to get a proper diagnosis, I needed to do for about 6 months to be 100% sure. This, of course, landed in my first term of Cambridge, so suffice to say that was incredibly difficult. Honestly, I did try my best to manage it all, but this was absolutely the worst point for my PMDD. By Christmas, I was so physically anxious about going back to Cambridge and having to deal with everything, I checked myself back into therapy, which was something I hadn't done in over a year. I am incredibly thankful for my therapist, as visiting her convinced me to stop prolonging the process of getting medical help just to prove to myself that this was actually happening and was a real issue. I was initially offered the contraceptive pill, something I personally was not comfortable with. So I opted for sertraline, an antidepressant with the lowest levels of withdrawal symptoms. And it took me about a week to adjust to it. The inertia was actually insane, but it was definitely so worth it. I find it kind of crazy now to think about how much PMDD affected my life now that it is something that I don't have to struggle with every single cycle. I still get low before my periods, don't get me wrong, and I have had one bad case of PMDD since starting sertraline, but nothing has ever been close to what it used to be. I'm healthier, I'm happier than I've ever been while taking this medication, and it's opened up so many more opportunities that I didn't think I could even vaguely manage before, including starting Galene and helping other women care for themselves. I actually get to be myself instead of constantly hanging over the self-destruct button. However, I will be honest, living in a society that not only shuns conversations around female sexual and reproductive health, but especially one that struggles with the concept of specifically the female mood, embracing and legitimizing what I have experienced in my head was weirdly difficult. In so many situations, those who identify as women are told that they're being too much, overreacting, being dramatic, and even today, some come out with that classic punchline, "Are you on your period or something?" Which genuinely, as somebody who suffers with something because of their period, is just such an awful thing to hear. PMDD is just one part of a much larger conversation around women and AFAB's health that so many people don't want to have. But now it really is coming at a cost. The well-being of women and the AFAB community, physically and mentally, is not an afterthought. I recently heard the term bikini medicine, which is this misconception that those who are born women are similar to men in all ways biologically, except for the body parts that fit under the bikini. It was used as a justification, not only to exclude women or AFAB from medical trials and research, but to disengage completely in any studies that focused on specifically female health-related issues, such as endometriosis, PCOS, so they weren't even going to think about the idea of a mood disorder. PMDD is not something that is discussed when those who menstruate learn about periods. We get tidbits about PMS and how cramps might affect us, but nowhere in our educational system is it acknowledged that sometimes your PMS is a bit more than just a bad mood. In the same way, conversations around menopause are finally gaining traction and opening women and the AFAB community up to the resources that they need to understand how their sexual and reproductive health is going to change throughout their life. Conversations about the conditions that we can experience off the back of our health, purely and simply because we have the reproductive organs that we do, need to be given the same power. I wouldn't be surprised that now this is starting to be spoken about in the media, women start to realize that this is something that they've been battling with for a very, very long time. You should be able to function on your period. You should be able to get out of bed on your period. But it is okay if you can't, because there is always an answer as to why. A big part of embracing my PMDD is learning to actively listen to my body and my mental well-being. I think it will come as no surprise that I like to be a productive person. As I have said, I've always been a hard worker and have always taken joy in dedicating a lot of my time to study and to work. Slowing down was not something I wanted to do, but if I didn't, it was going to cost me my health. I think so many of us are conditioned to think our success and fulfillment will suffer if we embrace relaxation, but I genuinely would not be here today if I didn't. Growing a true and healthy connection to my body and caring for my mind with all its ups and downs meant that I had to put these ideas like self-care at the forefront of my life. I wanted to understand my health, particularly my reproductive health, since it clearly had a much bigger impact than I thought. I slowed down. I took time for some mindfulness, and now I realize why it's so important for us all, particularly those who have been told their entire lives they can't take a break, aka women and the AFAB community, for us all to do so. Galene became for me a way of understanding not only why it's so important for women to know about their sexual and reproductive health, but also to explore my personal relationship with it. When your daily life is suffering and it's to do with your period, it shouldn't just be brushed off with, oh, it's just PMS. You deserve to know what's truly happening to your body. You deserve a safe space to ask those questions and know that you're totally supported in those journeys. Sometimes taking care of yourself really is stepping back and thinking, what's actually going on here? Self-care allowed me not only to reconnect with my body, but also create a community where all women and those assigned female at birth can do the same. And that brings us to the end of today's episode on why we should finally be talking about PMDD. Thank you for joining me and for listening to my story and why PMDD really is a part of a wider conversation around female health. It's conversations like these that can ignite change, foster support, and build a community grounded in understanding and empathy. Please remember, let's take a moment to remind ourselves that while this podcast is here to provide support and information, it cannot replace the advice of healthcare professionals. Always seek out professional guidance for any health concerns you may have. For more information on PMDD, and to explore the resources we offer, visit us at www.galenecompany.com. Our social self-care space is at @galenecompany_ on Instagram and Facebook. And if you found comfort or connection in our discussion today, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with others who might benefit. Until next time, take care of yourself. You really deserve it.